Hey guys, this is the Hard Times Strongmen podcast, training up a better class of man. And today we have a special guest for our medical crash course, Lance from Selous Dynamics. Lance, how are you doing, brother?
Man, I'm good. I couldn't get any better. My grandpa used to have a saying. He said, if I've been doing better, but I'm about to get over it. So I feel like that's where I am right now. So
I remember, oh, it was my buddy. He said he knew a guy who used to be in the SIRS, old dude, and he would always say, he'd get these drinks from Starbucks, like the Frappuccinos. And it's just this grizzled dude, looks like he's been like chiseled out of wood, tats at the whole deal. And he'd look at my buddy Den in the eye and say, "You can't be hard all the time."
that's it. That's it. Definitely it.
Well, for people who don't know you, Lance, so you have your company, Selous Dynamics. You do a lot. But for our listeners who don't know who you are, could you give a quick rundown, quick intro to who you are, what you do, and where you're going?
Yeah, of course, man. So right now, currently, I work full time in public safety. I work in an agency that does both fire and EMS services. I am a paramedic, and I do that full time in pre-hospital medicine. And I also teach with the state technical college system. I teach EMS and help with paramedic programs and do that thing. Also, at the same time, I'm attempting to use Selous as an outreach program to train individuals of all walks of life to learn all types of skills that will help them. We all have our own missions, and we all have, things that we want to do and things that we need to do, and we need an outlet to be able to get together and train together to complete that. And so I'm 100% aboard, trying to facilitate that as much as possible with those I come in contact with. So
Awesome. Well, you're obviously on brand for what we're going for with this. Our medical crash course series. This is basically just trying to pull the curtain back on medical care. We know that not a lot of guys have background in medical, pre-hospital care, post-hospital care, what have you, and that's just something that we need to get over because everybody has this one body, and it's your machine. If you can't use it, then you're SOL. So today, the focus I wanted to talk about was, I guess, basically pre-hospital care for just basic injuries. I want to talk about basic injury types, whether that be acute or chronic, traumatic or otherwise, and what that looks like in the pre-hospital setting, and just some basic care that people can be looking at, or if they're not comfortable or ready to obviously give that care at this point where they can be looking at and where they can be going, pushing towards in the future.
yeah, of course. So my biggest recommendation starting off is going to be one where anytime you're dealing with medical, you're dealing with a plethora of topics and different things that it takes a lifetime a lot of times to master certain levels and do certain things. And you obviously understand you can continue to train every single day and continue to get further and further. And that's the same way as any topic that you want to get into. So my biggest recommendation is finding a place that you can start with, that you can get into, get that base level of knowledge, and then continue to kind of climb with that. To be honest with you, wherever you're listening to this at and wherever you are and wherever you're starting at, I highly recommend that you take all of this with a grain of salt. This is not the only way of doing things. And I fervently teach that. Every class I teach, I tell every individual, this is a way of doing things, not the only way. And, the things I teach medically, obviously, is going to be evidence-based medicine. It's going to be, recognized best practices and that kind of stuff. And there are certain things I will be very staunch about and saying, yes, we need to try to deliver this care in this method and do that. But there are openings, to go. And so one of the things I was taught very early on, is one of the first days in med school, individuals are often taught, everything I teach you, 10 years from now, 50% of it will be wrong. I just can't tell you which 50% it's going to be. And that's very important to understand because with medicine, we evolve constantly. We are practicing medicine, which means that what we are doing right now may not be accurate in 10 years from now. What we were taught 10 years ago may not be accurate now. And I think we've seen, an insane amount of that occur. And understand the relevancy and the time that it takes for these practices to come online. We know right now if you open up an EMT textbook or you open up a paramedic textbook, what you are reading in that textbook right now was something that was being talked about and approved approximately 20 years ago. And that's easy numbers for us. So if you think about right now, 2023, we would be the amount of information going to a textbook would be several months after the invasion of Iraq. That's where we are right now. So
Oh
that
wow.
shows us how we need to grow and how we need to push forward with the way that we use technology, the way we use conferences, the way that we use classrooms to expedite that knowledge forward. So
100%. And thinking back to nursing school, to gold standards and evidence-based practice and everything else, we had instructors who wouldn't teach by the book because they were falling back to their prior training. So, like you said, making sure that your personnel, that your trainers are spun up to speed, and that everybody's on the same page is absolutely essential. And by definition, it doesn't happen. So, very, very huge. But I do love what you're doing with Selous, with taking a more holistic approach to to the problem of not just targeting fighting age males, but taking the family, taking the wife, taking the kids. Anybody who wants to learn can learn. That's absolutely essential.
that's right. And we often think that our force multipliers are going to be buddies and they're going to be, these guys over widespread areas and all that kind of stuff. But really, we need to start looking at how the world works around us and how other, nations, countries, lands, regions have gotten into certain conflicts over the years and what they've had. And, if you are, just a everyday guy and gal and you have no commitments whatsoever, you have no family, you have nothing, this model may not work for you. You may be completely fine trying to tap in with other individuals who are solos and make a run for whatever, but there's a lot of us with families and we have to figure out how to incorporate the total picture into what's going on. And I will say this, and I've always said it, but if you are talking that you're out there training, you're a guy with a spouse, you're a gal with a spouse, and you're the only one in the household training, then you are definitely far behind on what needs to happen. This needs to be an entire team approach. You need to have the entire family involved. A lot of times we try to take the significant other out of the equation and say, oh, well, they're not interested in that. This is something that I do. We need to find a way to make that happen because there's only two categories in which we all fall into, and that's everybody that we know, and that's liabilities and that's assets. And if you are not making assets, then you are absolutely fortifying liabilities, and that's a conversation that needs to be out in the open. And I've had tons of people tell me, just from simple contact with individuals and conversations, people that know me in real life, man, if anything ever happens, I'm coming to your house. Yeah, no, the hell you're not.
Yeah.
That's not how this works. You got to be counted on to be counted in. And, if we have individuals who are out there and they're not training, they're not prepared, they're living their life, which I have no problem with people living a normal life. I try to do that as much as I can because for our mental and spiritual health, that's obviously absolute paramount to try to find balance. But the problem is that at the end of the day, you cannot go out and watch football and do this and do that and put no time in the game of training and preparing. And when things get uncomfortable for you, the only thing you're going to show up to at my house or your house is going to be, your diabetic mother-in-law and a can of beefaroni. That's not how this works. So we have to plow in now. We have to have those uncomfortable conversations now and start figuring out where do we sit on each side of the line, and where we go from there with it. So
So coming from someone who isn't from you know, uh, the pre-hospital or even medical field, um, what are some basic things that these people need to be learning, short of the hitting the fan kind of thing? Like, what's just some these basic level knowledge and skills that people need to be learning just to start off with, just to be a warm fuzzy kind of thing?
sure. Well, I would tell you this. The approach I've always tried to take with almost everything that I do is kind of like 1 inch away from the body and then to affinity. I know that might sound strange, but you think about like survival and the rules of three, how that works. And we can go into much more detail on that in the future, but some of you probably have heard that before. When it comes to medicine, we're talking about the same thing. The first thing that I would try to encompass is how it reflects to your everyday carry and your everyday preparation, because that will probably be your first contact and the most statistical, field that you're going to get into. And so with that, I highly recommend that a lot of individuals start by focusing on trauma care. They start focusing on combat type trauma. We're talking about, gunshot wounds, high ballistic lateral fragmentation, all those things that encompass that. And they start learning how to manage simple trauma cases. And to be honest with you, there's a whole reason. If you've never heard of the Hartford Consensus and understanding where that's coming from, you need to go look it up. That's a very civilian side of the house. That's a response to Sandy Hook and everything that happened, and a national response that went from there. But this is what brought us programs like Stop the Bleed. This is what brought us programs like Rescue Task Force across national public safety. And this gets us to the point that individuals need to have a very basic kit with them, and they need to focus on bleeding control, hemorrhage control, all these type of tools that they can use to do that. And so that's where I would start, is basic trauma care, bleeding control, and then moving into things like basic airway management, basic respirations, and then algorithms that have been built, through evidence-based medicine and best practices, kind of moving forward from there. Once we start understanding that whole concept and we know how to treat it, then we need to start looking at more long-term care, prolonged field care, and just basic medicine and basic medical practices for sustaining a healthy human over a certain period of time. I mean, that's my opinion. That would be my approach on it. And that's kind of how I would recommend others start taking a bite of the elephant, at a time with that. So
I like it.
Well, and the great thing is that framework's already there. We have TC3, we have
That's right.
fire, tactical field care, tactical evacuation care, we have prolonged field care, and we have resources like deployed medicine, which is everything the Army has to this point. We have everything that people can tap into, and the plethora of GWAT folks that are putting on those classes. So it's readily available. People just need to get into it. But 100% agree. So your Stop the Bleed, your care under fire, moving into March, with your hemorrhage, your airway, everything else. Towards the end of that list, worried about CPR, but that's very readily available too. I mean, any medical, anybody working in healthcare has to be BLS certified, have that up to date. So a lot of the stuff is already here.
That's correct.
But I feel like, what, I completely agree with the spirit of what you're saying. And, the whole I'll show up to your house mentality needs to go, because I feel like this is not even, on one side of the house or the other, but I feel like it's just being a responsible adult. This is a societal problem. If you cannot help someone if they're in a medical emergency, then like you said, you're a liability. You're one of those people hanging around the sidelines, taking a video with your phone. As a society, as a culture, we need to get better.
Yeah, I 100% agree with that. And to be honest with you, we have to think about what we perceive and what we find out is our response. And so with Selous from day one, I've always been about, very much an what I call an all hazards approach. You think about just a combination of things and how you can, buffer against it, train against it, and how you can move forward with that as individuals. Yes, you carry a gun, you carry this, you carry that. That's great. You need that all hazards approach. But as a pre-hospital provider, if someone were to think about what I do for a living and what I have the most experience in, I can guarantee you is it someone who is suffering multi-system trauma from gunshot wounds, or is it someone who is in cardiac arrest from a medical pathophysiological problem? And the answer is going to be that cardiac arrest. Just as a society, just what we face on a statistical area, we have to be able to conform to what we're going to experience. And we have to think about that. Yes, we all have this idea of what I call my gunfight. And, we think about, okay, well, I'm going to be in the woods with 4 or 5 of my buddies, and we're going to be running and gunning and breaking contact and doing all these things. And yes, you may prepare for that. And yes, you may build for that. And that's outstanding. You should definitely think about those concepts. But what are you going to do before then? What are you going to do now when I go to work in the morning, or when I go on vacation, or when I do this? What am I going to face? And if you get into contact with something, and if you've heard anything I've ever done, our individuals in uniform, they're not first responders. And I know that will kind of chafe some of them. That's fine, deal with it. But we're not first responders. I tell you that I'm a second responder, because a lot of times when something has happened, there is a layman on hand who is a part of it. And I'll be honest with you, we hear it nonstop in certain calls where the dispatching authority will tell us that the persons on scene have refused instructions on care. Okay? And that includes family. That includes people who are closest to the individual refusing CPR, refusing any other thing. They say, I can't do it. I don't know how to do it. I'm going to wait until something happens. And the problem with that, and I think we are all understanding that no matter what your baseline level is that when these events occur, time is life. We don't have time. We don't have seconds and minutes to delay. It needs to happen quickly, it needs to happen aggressively, and go from there. So if you are one of those first responders, which is the layman on scene, you need to be able to do something immediately, and you need to be able to do something aggressively, and it needs to be accurate in nature. So if you think, and I'll tell this to anybody out there, if you think you are above going to take a CPR course because you think that that's not sexy, you think that that's not, SEAL Team 6 enough for you, you're wrong. I'm just flat out telling you are wrong. There is only one thing that is sexy out there in the training, and that is brilliance in the basics. And if you are not interested in the basics, and you're not interested in building upon that, you are probably going to find yourself in a complete cycle of failure over and over and over again, no matter what you're trying to encompass. So that is definitely my recommendation on that, is try to seek out all the subjects, try to get the training in and things that we consider basic or mundane or whatever, and really maximize on that and really specialize in those things. Because, when the metal hits the meat, that is generally the things that we need the most, and we need it the fastest. And I try to tell it, as an instructor and as an educator, and teaching high echelon, medical care, is that probably 95% of the time, I do not do things that are some type of mystical, magical, very in-depth practice. 95% of the time, if I'm going to intervene in something that is going to have somebody live or die, and hopefully it's going to be live, because that's what we're after, it is going to be something that is basic in nature. It's going to be rapid recognition of what's going on, and it is going to be rapid and accurate intervention of what's taking place. And generally, it will be at a very basic level. And so that's what we need to get to, all of us, where we are applying that same type of practice to our approach to do that. None of us are too good, or too cool to practice basics and really, really master those. So
100%. And we never will be. Brilliance in the basics, like you said, that is something that needs to be, beaten to death, because that's what you're going to fall back to. When you lose everything else in the moment, you have your foundation that you've built. If you don't have a foundation, then, like you said, you're just going to be lost in that cycle of failure, and that can be catastrophic when you're talking about medical emergencies. So, digging a little more into the subject, so let's go into some basic types of injuries. So, some injuries sustained. So, lacerations, abrasions, burns. So, laceration, you want to dig into that, and that can be, small, large, small, whatever you feel like will be most effective.
yeah, and I'll preface it by saying this: the way that I was taught originally was a ditty, and I think we've probably heard this term before, but it was keyword CALLOP: crush, abrasion, laceration, incision, and puncture. And those were the 5 types of wounds. And obviously, I've learned that there's more and there's different variations, but at the core level, I actually still will teach that concept. And so when I break this down, okay, and bear with me for a minute, there are things that we need to understand about the parts of the body that will be affected by this, okay? And if you can imagine in your mind, obviously we're here on audio, and so you have to use your brain and create images of what we're saying. But these practices and these wounds and these aspects will cover certain areas. And I need you to take the 4 limbs of the body, the arms and the legs, and I need you to separate them into their own zone. And then I need you to take the core of the body, which is going to be the chest and the abdomen, and I need you to keep it in its own zone. Okay. And then later on, we'll talk about the head and how, our nervous system and everything takes effect and how it'll be its own zone and everything like that. But when we get into concept of lacerations, right, and this is simple as it is, a laceration means that we have some type of object that is sharp or it is fast, and it will cut through flesh and it will create an elongated channel through that flesh. And it can be deep, it can be shallow, it doesn't matter. But if we've probably all cut ourselves before with a knife, and you know what that looks like, okay? When you take a dive into the anatomy, the limbs or the extremities, they are the ones that we are probably going to see the most musculoskeletal damage and vascular damage faster than the other zones. And the reason being is because the limbs are made for one purpose: to support the skeleton, to support the body, and to create locomotion and movement for that to occur. So yes, they are full of muscle, they are full of blood, and they are full of bone. They will create any type of movement, any type of dynamic, type of activity. That is their sole purpose, is to support the rest of that body. So when this occurs, the best thing that you can look for, and the quickest thing you can look for, is how deep is this laceration and how bad is it? How much are we bleeding from this, right? And I will explain this and try to keep it as basic as possible. But there are 3 different types of vasculature that we will find in the body, okay? And in the base level, they are built by size. And I try to basically describe this even in EMT courses, where we think about going to Lowe's and we look at plumbing and we look at plumbing supplies and we look at pipes and couplings and all these different things. Here's what we're looking at. When you take a look, the largest pipes that we have in our body, they're going to be of 2 categories. They're going to be going and they're going to be coming, right? And the central thing that ties those together is going to be the heart. That's going to be the grand pump or the grand motor in the body. And all of those pipes that are moving away from the body, they are supplying oxygen-rich blood to the tissues, which we must have, and those will be arterial in nature. Those are going to be arteries, arterioles, and they're going to go into the capillary section and then switch back and start going into the pipes that are going to bring blood back to the heart, right? And the blood that is coming back to the heart does not have that oxygen-rich characteristic to it. It has given its oxygen to the tissues, and it has picked up metabolic waste, mostly in the format of carbon dioxide and other elements, and it must now get rid of those elements out of the body. So when we come away from that, those capillaries switch into a venous model. We go into venules, which are a little larger, and then we go into veins, which are even larger, back to the heart. So on the actual extremity portion of what we're looking at, if we cut into that flesh and we cut into that tissue, I need people to understand that most of the time, almost all considerations, is that arteries and arterioles are much deeper in the tissue than what we see veins and capillaries, okay? And so a lot of times if you have a shallow wound channel, for the most part, thankfully, we will run into a venous type of bleed. And that means that we're not seeing a spurting type of blood. We're not seeing it match with a pulse. A lot of time it's slow and it's oozing coming out of those pipes. That's great. That's really what we want. That's what we would love to work with and deal with. But then sometimes when we go into certain places and we go to certain depths, that's when our wounds will develop an arterial nature to them, where we will see a much more larger source of blood and bleeding, and we will see a pulsatile type of bleeding, where the pulse matches what the heart is doing. And we know we're pretty much in trouble when it comes to that, because obviously we're understanding you only have so much blood in your body, and every individual person, you only have so much blood. And I know we're all taught that we all have on average 5 liters of blood in the body. That's actually not accurate. It's actually weight based according to your size. And I will tell you right off the bat, if you were a male, what you could do if you want to figure out how much blood you have in your body right now is you need to turn your weight into kilograms, right? You need to be able to take that pounds, and you need to be able to convert to kilograms. And basically from there, what you're going to do is you're going to multiply. A male is 75 milliliters per kilogram. If you take that number, you're going to get a 4-digit number, right? Which will be how many milliliters of blood you have in the body. If you just put a decimal point after that first number, you're looking at liters, right? So myself, I weigh about 235, and for myself, I'm looking at close to about 8 liters of blood that's in my body. That's a lot more than what we're taught, as far as the 5 liters. And most of us cannot determine by looking at a person and how they're wounded, how much blood has left the body. We have to look at signs and symptoms to determine, how much blood have we lost and what is a recovery and what are we looking at from that. So going from there, those lacerations that we see can make up a very large and dangerous spectrum of blood loss. And anytime we look at our extremities, we generally will have a more rapid blood loss there in that skeletal tissue that we must stop. And to be honest with you, that first line that you're going to deal with is going to be tourniquet usage. Those extremities, the tourniquets are made for extremities. That is the first line of what's happening. We used to be in the practice that, we'll use direct pressure on these areas. We'll use and if direct pressure doesn't work, then we'll go to a tourniquet. Well, we've reversed that. There's no sense of going to direct pressure on these wounds, because all you are doing is prolonging time. And there's only so much blood, and the more blood that you lose, the worse chance you have over time, not just in the immediate moment, but over the next, 36, 48 hours and all the deeper things that go with that. So I 100% recommend any of these wounds that you see pulsatile type of bleeding, we go to a tourniquet, and in conjunction with that, we can also use wound packing for these wound channels as well, trying to find these places of pulsatile bleeding and pack this bleeding and do all that kind of stuff. So that covers lacerations, and that covers a lot of physiology that we would have to talk about later when it comes to other types of wounds, and just getting that out of the way as well. So
Awesome. Would you just mention real quick just some basic guidelines for tourniquet usage and tourniquet placement, how to check a tourniquet, and then you mentioned wound packing, which a lot of people do wrong.
Yeah, and it has been such an aggravation, to be honest with you, to see certain characters and personalities and individuals on social media, and I've watched it for several years now, that we've gone through our tourniquet usage, and obviously understanding people not staging them correctly, not doing this, and there was a lot of ego involved or whatever. And there's a very Dunning-Kruger effect with a lot of these individuals I've seen. And to me, that's a very aggravating aspect to it. And I will tell you this, when it comes to tourniquet usage, you're generally taught 2 practices, to use, and that is either high and tight, which means you go to the very top of that limb towards the core, and you place that tourniquet there, right? The other aspect is that you are taught 2 to 3 inches above the wound. Okay, as long as that is not on a joint. You will not put a tourniquet on a knee. You will not put a tourniquet on an elbow. Those are non-compressible joints. We cannot use that to work in that aspect. However, this is my recommendation for those who do not have a background in medicine and who are using, a bare bones approach. I recommend that you go high and tight with your tourniquet. And the reason being is because it's less time that you are attempting to expose the wound. You are getting there, you are actually applying it, you're stopping that bleed immediately. There's other things that laymen don't understand about the application. We can have an injury that will occur, and for use big words or med terms, we can have vasculature that will rescind into the cavity, that endothelial cell reaction where it wants to protect itself and it retracts. If you cut major arteries, there is a chance that the elasticity of that will cause that withdrawal. So if you're using a 2 to 3 inches above the wound, you actually could be placing a tourniquet past the point where that vasculature is exposed and retracted. That's going to cause a large hematoma, collection of blood into the tissues, and we are still losing blood. It may not be as bad, but we're still not where we need to be. I would rather the layman person go high and tight and then have a higher echelon provider assess the wound and then figure out where we need to go with tourniquet conversion and then fixing that later on, okay? When you look at tourniquets and you look at their usage, the organization COTC is kind of the guide to what we use, the Council on Tactical Combat Casualty Care. And they don't sponsor anything. They just recommend things based on evidence. And that's kind of what we use to choose tourniquets. I'm not sponsored by North American Rescue, but I guarantee you that all the medical gear that I use for tourniquets comes from North American Rescue. I've used several different types in the field. I've trained thousands at this point on different applications and different ones. And I will tell you that using a combat application tourniquet, in my opinion, is the number one tool that I will put into the field every time. The combat application tourniquet or the CAT tourniquet is the one that I have had to come behind other brands to fix their application with a CAT. Okay, I've never had to come behind a CAT and fix it, but I've had to go beyond or behind other COTC recommended tourniquets and fix them. So, if you're out there and you're looking for tourniquets, which you should, and you're wanting to buy them, let me go ahead and give you a disclaimer. Do not buy your tourniquets off of Amazon. There's a good chance they're made in China and they are fake. Don't be the individual who says, well, I found this tourniquet on Amazon and it's half the cost and it looks like the same thing as that tourniquet. Don't do that. There's a reason it's half the cost. There's a reason it's made in China. You're going to trust your life to something that is, made subpar. It's going to break when you use it more than likely. You need to avoid that. Just go for the real thing. And, I think right now a CAT tourniquet costs $29, somewhere in there. If your life isn't worth $29, then I don't know what to tell you, on that aspect. So buy the real thing, use the real thing. I highly recommend, if you're going to buy one tourniquet, you buy two tourniquets. One's a training tourniquet, one's a real tourniquet. You mark the one that's the trainer and you use it. We understand that even though they're great, there's only so many times they can be used and tightened until eventually they all will break. You don't want that being your primary. You want that to be your actual trainer. So that's my recommendation for the tourniquet usage. Obviously, tourniquets can only be used on extremities. There's other scenarios that we can create junctionals, but that's much more down the road and their application on that. But definitely for lacerations, definitely for deep wound channels. With arterial bleeding, we are going to go, my recommendation is high and tight application of those tourniquets until a higher echelon provider can assess and determine a further treatment plan for that.
100%. And then could you also touch on wound packing?
Yeah, of course. So wound packing is very interesting. And the way I like to describe this is because I get this question all the time. Well, which one's better, tourniquet or wound packing, right? It truly depends on what you're dealing with, right? The shape of the wound, the characteristic of the wound, and the resources that you have on hand. So to me, it's not a one or the other. A lot of times it's used in conjunction with both or a resource dependent scenario of what I'm going to use and how I'm going to do it. Now, when we talk about obviously the extremities, arms and legs, there generally is not anything that a tourniquet cannot handle, right? We find very few situations where a tourniquet cannot take care of the extremity bleed. Even when we deal with the legs and we're looking at individuals with larger tissue, larger legs, for whatever reason, muscular, obese, or whatever, we can look at a concept called kissing tourniquets, where we have two tourniquets that are side by side. They're increasing the actual space of pressure that's on the arterial bleed and shutting off the blood to the extremity. But if we kind of move up from those areas and we start talking about junctional areas, in our pelvis, in our hip, in, our armpits, underneath, our subclavian areas, even all those locations, we can't put tourniquets on those places. Yeah, you can use junctional tourniquets, but you would have to have a commercial tourniquet or you would have to be able to manufacture a hasty improvised junctional tourniquet very rapidly, which I'll be honest with you, even with advanced providers, a lot of them cannot do because they just don't practice it enough or they don't have the resources on hand. So when you want to do wound packing, I want you to imagine if you were to dig a hole, right? You're digging a well in the ground and you say, okay, well, I got water that's rising up in this well, and that water is blood, and that blood is coming from some type of broken pipe. And that pipe can be an artery. It's been hurt. A piece of that outside wall is missing, and blood is just filling up into this space. If you don't stop that bleeding, that person will eventually die or be put into a situation where they're just simply not going to survive long term, anyways, because of the insult that's occurred. When we're doing the wound packing, I try to make a mental image of almost Tetris, right? You remember the different pieces and how you shape them and how they fall down to the bottom, and you want them layered evenly as they go to the top. You don't want any gaps, you don't want any spaces.
We'll fill the whole space.
Right. Or if you think about pouring concrete into this hole, you're wanting to basically take this device, this item, a gauze, a hemostatic gauze, which it just means that it helps you clot, is all that is. And you want to pack it forcefully and tightly into the entirety of this space, because you're creating a false wall against the vasculature that is bleeding. You need to create a wall there in which the blood can slow down, because only when it slows down is it going to allow clotting abilities to take place and the bleeding to stop. And so then we're going to continue to pack that wound channel all the way out to the surface, like Tetris, fill in all those gaps. And then we're going to get to that place where we come to the outer edge. And then at that outer edge, we can apply direct pressure. We can use pressure bandages and keep that plug in place to stop that bleeding, until we can figure out a surgical answer for that damage that's been done. Because all of this is based upon the ability to access surgery in the end. A tourniquet is no different in a conversion. Wound packing is no different in its conversion. We all need definitive care to take care of this at the end of the day. So, and there's two types of items that we find for wound packing. They're going to be the hemostatic gauze and they're going to be regular gauze. The hemostatic gauze, the biggest ones that we see are going to be the Selous, and they're going to be the quick clot. Those are the ones that use a hemostat, which helps encourage clotting. It's either a chitosan or a kaolin, which means a shellfish or a crustacean or a clay-based material to help encourage clotting, or just regular gauze, which has nothing in it. But obviously the hemostatic will cause a clot to occur quicker than the regular gauze. And that's something that we need to understand when we go to use those in our kits, about what our limitations and our times are as far as the application of those devices will be.
What's your opinion on some of these guys saying, "Oh, well, for wound packing, I just carry around a tampon"?
Jesus. I have a simple process to that. And I don't mean to be, yeah, I do. I'm an asshole. I'm just going to say that.
Do it.
I do mean
Send
to
it.
just go for it. If you think that a tampon will take care of bullet holes, you neither understand vaginas nor bullet holes. Okay. And that goes back to simple principles for you. Okay. That tampon is used to control, approximately 30 to 50, cc's of blood, maybe total. This is even that would be a widespread, version of it. More than likely, you're probably talking about much smaller than that, 5 cc's maybe. But the issue with that is that if you think you can take this small plug of cotton and put it into just the middle of a channel and expect it to perform, you have no idea what's going on underneath the surface there. You need to be able to put, I'll put it this way. When we use live meat in training, which we do often when we do wound packing, I have simulators, but I always love to use real meat to simulate because it really sets the tone and brings it home to individuals. I can take, 2 4-yard, talking about 16-foot long, right, rolls of gauze and put them into one wound channel. You're talking about a massive amount of gauze going into a wound channel. That is nothing compared to a tampon. And what's going to happen, if you place a tampon into a wound channel, it is just going to continue to bleed underneath it. You're going to have this large pocket of bleeding and this hematoma will occur, and the blood loss has not stopped. Eventually, it will soak all the way through, and blood will go past that, and it is nothing but a conduit. It's a mop at that time, and blood will just continue to come out of that wound. So if you think a tampon is going to work for this, then I'm sorry, you're wrong. That's just not how that works. That's never been a thing. That never will be a thing, and you need to go ahead and just dump that and go to things that are known to work. So
We all knew the answer
It
to
goes
that,
back to
but it needed to be said.
you
I
just want to be
Oh
inflammatory.
yeah, yeah, I had to.
It goes back to how serious you take your health and the people who you plan on being under your care. It's the same thing as trusting an off-brand tourniquet or these weird practices that aren't based on evidence that are just he said she said sort of stuff.
that's
This is too important for not just yourself. I mean, you can do with you what you want, but if you're planning on taking care of somebody else as a good Samaritan, or as a husband, as a father, as a community member, then you need to do your due diligence here.
absolutely,
And
absolutely.
there's so much stuff in life that you can just skimp on. You can buy the cheap stuff, and I feel like one of the most important things in life is medical, and you should not ever skimp on quality on that stuff. So don't buy cheap on this crap.
Just to give you a quick anecdote, I had a med class years ago where a gentleman showed up and he had what he called an IFAC, and he had like things like zip ties, in his IFAC, and he was going to use those for tourniquets. And yes, yeah, 100%. I joked because when he dumped out his IFAC, it was very much like the scene in Jaws where they catch that first shark and they cut up in his belly, and there's like a boot and a
It's all
license
trash.
plate and just trash in there. And that's kind of what he was rolling with on that. And it's just, it comes from, oh, well, my buddy who's this and that, or my buddy who's friends with this guy, this is what they said that they use, and this is what we can. And that's not how that works. We have to be able to, in all things, go into evidence-based practices. And I'm one of those individuals right now that if you came to me and you show me evidence-based medicine, and if it contradicts what I know, instead of digging in, I'll say, cool, roger that. Let's go in that direction right now. I'll adapt immediately, maintain my flexibility, and we'll go into whatever that best practice is. Now, we'll do that until that changes into something else. And I feel like that's how that works with everything that we do, no matter the discipline. That should be the flexibility that we take to the field of understanding that things do change. We do learn more things, and we do learn better things. And we must always be able to move in those directions, whatever it may be. So.
Definitely. So moving on to abrasions. So abrasions, scrapes, rubs, it's trauma to your integumentary system. It's trauma to your skin, causing enough kinetic energy, scraping against that outer layer to where you're actually causing damage. You're opening up that, those lower levels of tissue. You have the opportunity to get infection to, depending on the severity, affect the underlying anatomy there. But obviously this will base on severity, but what should be some highlights for people wanting to manage this on their own?
So when we think about the skin and we think about its purpose, we're talking about, number one, is to keep the outside world from coming in, right? It's to keep the inside of us from coming out. And it's also to help us regulate both our temperature and our, ability to maintain hydration, electrolytes, everything else that goes with that. And that's why we see in burn patients or whatever that exchange and third spacing and all that other kind of stuff. Now, when we have abrasions, we're generally taking just the outer layer of the epidermis or a little bit of the lower layer of the dermis, and we're taking that away from some type of kinetic force. Your drug against something, friction generally is what's based upon that. A raspberry, road rash, whatever that is.
I was gonna say road rash for sure.
For sure.
Yeah.
And we're taking that layer off. Now, at that top layer, a lot of times it's not very deep vasculature there. We're looking at capillary type effects. So if you look at that raspberry, so to speak, you'll see these little droplets of blood that are really small, and that's the exposed capillary that are just, blood is just coming out of that area. Now, for the most part, it is an annoyance for us, right? Everyday life, it would be an annoyance. Long-term application, though, we do look that once we have an opening in that flesh, then we now have the ability for bacteria to enter an unprotected space and come into the body. No matter what, if you look at, all the things, if you're not dealing with massive hemorrhage in the modern battlefield or immediate airway compromise, the number one killer of individuals to this day is still infection. They survive, they go home, they go through the process. Infection is still that killer that faces them. So with us, if we're talking about austere environments, we may not have antibiotics, we may not have, sterile supplies or whatever. You will be dealing with that same concept. So I highly recommend anytime that you find yourself with that abrasion, what needs to happen, we need to bandage that. We need to protect it, and we need to make sure that we are trying to keep a minimum amount of stuff that's going into it. In the process of how the flesh works and what occurs is we can't keep something covered nonstop. Okay. You look at anybody who's in wound care or they're in, any type of long-term, ulcers, decubitus, whatever it may be, you cannot just keep that covered nonstop because generally we have three different things that are trying to kill us at any given time on the patho level. We've got fungus, we've got bacteria, and we got virus that's trying to get into our body at some point. And we can succumb to any of those three, and that's what makes up the bulk of our infections as it enters the body. With that entire aspect, though, we have to be able to say, okay, we've covered this wound. However, this wound still needs to open back up. We need to be able to actually take the bandage off, allow some things to dry out. We don't need to keep it wet full time because if we take, bacteria and we wrap it and we keep it tight and then we create an anaerobic environment, then we can start looking at fungal infections and then back and forth. So the best thing is going back and forth, keeping it clean, keeping it washed, cover it again, let it dry, wash, cover it again, and so on and so forth. One of the awesome books that I've read years ago, and I still highly recommend it, is a book that's called Ditch Medicine. You find it online. It is very austere in nature. It's probably 20, 30 years old right now. But one of the interesting things that they showed in this book was using sugar to treat wounds in austere environments. And what's crazy about it is, the fact that the sugar was used, the case study was a man who had shot himself in the foot with a shotgun. So he probably had a hole in the top aspect of his foot all the way through about the size of a $50. Well, that wound obviously doesn't want to close. It's a circle. It doesn't want to granulize very well.
Approximate.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. So he battled that, and it stayed open, and it stayed open, and it stayed open. Well, they started packing it with sugar, and it healed, very quickly. And the thing to realize with the sugar is that, at first when it's applied, it creates an anaerobic environment, which the bacteria doesn't want to be a part of. But if you allow it to sit and mix with the fluid that's coming out of the cells, it will create this liquid goo that will attract anaerobic properties. And then it will turn into infection in other ways. So what they would have to do is pack it with sugar. And then 12 hours later, unwrap it, wash it, clean it, pack it with sugar, unwrap it, and then continue this process over time, which allowed it to heal on its own. So that takes some ability to observe and do those type of things as well.
That's so interesting to me.
Very, very cool how that works. Very cool. So yeah, any abrasions, whatever you're looking at, whether it's a small abrasion versus, a larger, like an avulsion where we have a flap that opens up on something, you need to understand, has the vasculature been affected? Is the tissue necrotic and dying because of it? How can we affect that? If we're getting larger where we need to debride the wound and cut off the dead tissue and then apply or whatever. And those are things on the simple level. We just don't have good answers for that, obviously, with a lower echelon treatment. But for sure, no matter what you're doing, the skin is the baseline layer. Protect the skin. I know we're all dudes and we're hardcore and we're this and that. Use lotion, right? Especially in the wintertime or whatever. When you get cracks in your skin and your fingers are all, like mine are actually right now, I should preach into the choir. When you have problems with that, those cracks in those areas allow bacteria to get in. It allows infection to come in. And in an austere environment, if you're staying wet, if you're staying sweating, if you're staying, not letting your your clothes dry, your boots dry, you will develop sores, and those sores will fester and cause infection. It will kill you in the end. So you have to be able to take care of that skin layer and make sure that nothing can kind of get into the body from there on those. So very important.
Jesus, as we're all sitting here checking our fingertips to see how cracked they are.
We're all gonna
Well, I
we're
was
all
just
gonna
thinking,
die.
I never had this issue until I moved to Texas. I'm from Oregon
Yeah.
originally,
Gotcha.
but I moved to Texas, and my thumbs especially, like they will like open up like overnight to where they'll bleed.
Sure.
Like it's absolute insanity. But to your point about about those friction points, and just it will sneak up on you. It will sneak up on you so fast. I know that we've all had issues with like boots, just like
Yeah.
rubbing into your heels, into your toes, into the balls of your feet, top of your feet especially. You'll get lit up. But I used to work in long-term care, and just the action of laying with your body weight
Oh
in
yeah.
one position for too long,
And decubitus ulcers and
it
all that.
will,
Yeah,
yeah,
for sure.
yeah. And people don't even think about it. But talking especially about long-term care, talking about uh what am I trying to say, like prolonged field care, taking care of someone over a long period of time, like it will mess you up.
Yeah, coming up with a
And
rotation
it's so
schedule for
hard.
casualties, doing all
Mhm.
things and keep them from laying on hard surfaces, using
And after it
spine
starts, it's so
boards,
hard to
etc.
manage.
All that stuff. Yeah, for
Yeah,
sug
but absolutely essential. You touched on burns a little bit,
hmm
especially with hydration, infection. Do you want to dig into that a little bit more?
Yeah, of course. So burns are something that you're going to have a very high fatality, percentage when it comes to burns. And
Right.
burns obviously are categorized according to the size and the depth and the heat and the contact. There's different types of burns. You have chemical burns, you have thermal burns. You have this aspect, but you have to understand that a burn is basically characterized as any time you have some type of heat, energy, or device that comes into contact with the flesh, and it will raise the temperature or a caustic reaction, and it will cause cellular destruction because of that. Now, when that occurs, we have different areas, right? We look at the actual width of the burn. That's going to be the surface area that it expands, and then we look at the depth of the burn. So we used to use, degrees of burn, 1st-degree burn, 2nd-degree, 3rd-degree burn. We're no longer using that. We're no longer teaching that. We're now dealing with superficial burns, partial thickness burns, and full thickness burns. That's the scope that has replaced those. And I'm very lucky. I live in Georgia, and we have JM Styles in Augusta, which is a massive, burn center here. And they are some of the individuals that teach advanced burn life support. And I highly recommend, if you're a provider, to go take that course and to learn everything that goes with that. But the issue with is that when we have these burns, we must calculate the width of the burn and the depth of the burn. And then we must look at the cellular destruction that goes with that, because it can be as simple as like a superficial burn is a sunburn. It's a little bit red. That's it. You have the outer layer has been affected by some type of radiation or even thermal contact, and we just have that destruction. Now, over the next couple of days, it's going to dry out. The cells are going to die. You're going to start peeling, and then the base layer is coming out underneath it. You're probably fine. When we get into superficial burns, which used to be the 2nd-degree burn, we're going to see the redness, and we're also going to see the developing of blisters at that point, and even what is called light sloughing, which is where the tissue is dead on top and it's just coming off, like you can peel layers like you're taking a blister off or something like that. That can get a little bit worse, obviously, and very prone to infection or whatever. And then the full thickness burn is going to be anywhere from what we call the 3rd-degree burn to the 4th-degree burn, where we are burning through tissue, we are burning through nerve, we are burning through bone even sometimes, depending on how we have it. Now, the management of burns is going to be a game of long-term care, right? Because it's not the burn that kills you, it's the metabolic effect upon the body. And if we look at areas like extremities, and if we have what we call as a circumferential burn, which means it burns all the way around the edge of that flesh, you got to think about that burn. If you ever cooked a steak and you burned a steak or anything before, you've looked at it and you say, damn, that's tough. I probably don't want to eat that, right? Same thing with any other type of flesh. It's going to be hard, it's going to be leathery, and it's going to build what's called an eschar. And if that happens on an extremity, it's going to be tight, And what happens is that flesh is going to want to swell against that because of the edema and the fluid that occurs. And we can most definitely have something called compartment syndrome that occurs. The blood flow versus what is returning is not adequate, and we are going to probably lose that limb, if not cause death, through the metabolic waste that builds up in the body, which is very dangerous at that point in time. You'll even, if you ever want to look at a fasciotomy, escharotomy, you'll see these images of them cutting deep gouging cuts through the flesh and the fascia.
Long.
Yes, to allow the tissue to expand. It's pretty gruesome. It's pretty terrible. That's probably a place I would never want to work as a burn unit. I just, from learning and being a part of that, that's a terrible thing going on there.
No, it'd be miserable.
Yes, 100%. Yeah. So you have that going on, and then the other thing is that the effect of the body. We understand that the tissue in the skin, like I talked about earlier, it is that outside layer protecting you from, damage, infection, all these things. But when we upset the balance of the way that tissue is built, we are made of nothing but fluids and salts. At our basic level, fluids and salts. If you know what electrolytes are, you ever taken a common, chemistry class or whatever, you will understand that every electrolyte, whether it's potassium, calcium, sodium, whatever, it is a salt. It is crystalline in nature. It doesn't have to be sodium chloride to be salt. It is a salt. And so what occurs is we are always looking for the movement that's appropriate in these electrolytes and these fluids throughout the body, and that's how we do everything. That's how we live. And so with these burns, we are opening ourselves up for the fluids and the salts to move out of the places they are supposed to be into places they are not supposed to be. And if you ever want to look up third spacing or interstitial fluid, you'll see that. And these burn patients will weep. This fluid will continue to shift and it will happen. And what it looks like is really no different than a patient who has massive blood loss. The amount of blood serum in the vasculature will decline. Blood pressures will drop. They will look like shock is occurring. There's things, it's relative hypovolemia. And so with these individuals, we must have very aggressive fluid resuscitation with them to keep them. Because what happens is that if we have this collection of, of metabolic processes and waste, it's going to kill the body processes. A lot of our burn patients don't die from the burn. They die from the secondhand effect. We'll see our kidneys fail, our liver fail, our lungs fail, and our brain fail. Something called MODS, your multiple organ dysfunction syndrome, is going to kill them. It's going to wipe them out. That kidney failure is very real because if you look at all these metabolic processes that are in the blood that are trying to be processed out, it will kill those kidneys and lead to, very aggressive death from there on out. I will tell you this, if you're dealing with a burn patient on a simple level, do not put wet things on a burn patient, right? That used to be the thing. When I was in the military and even overseas, we had burn blankets and they come in a canister and they had this goo that was on them. We thought that was real high speed at the time. We come to find out that's not. If you are burned, do not put that extremity or whatever it is underneath cold water. It needs to be tepid water, which is room temperature, because if you think about how blood moves through the tissue, when you are hot, the vasculature opens up. When you're cold, it constricts and it goes down. If I have a burn, I have tissue damage. And if I put something cold on top of that, it causes the vasculature to shrink, meaning that on the outside edges, there's not proper blood flow, and the zone of damaged flesh will continue to expand upon the original area and become larger. So use tepid water to stop the burning process, to remove the heat. And then what we need to do is look at a dry, sterile bandage to go on burns, not a wet bandage to go on there. So dry, sterile burns on the management of that, and then looking at the concept that we need to be moving this casualty very rapidly to a place that we can get antibiotics in them, that we can get, a massive amount of fluid resuscitation in them. If you're ever curious to look at what is called the Parkland formula or the consensus formula on how to manage burn patients, that is the scope that we use pre-hospital and hospital on how much fluids will go into that patient. And it can be a massive amount of fluids going into them to try to maintain renal function and to get rid of the imbalance of electrolytes that's going on in them. So
I was going to say it's enormous.
Massive, very massive. So But definitely keeping it clean, keeping it dry, and trying to manage from there with them. So
All right, moving on to ecchymosis. So not too life threatening,
no.
but just some. So generally, so when I say ecchymosis, I mean bruise. So bruising, you've received trauma to normally an extremity, depending on your method of injury, but you see that darkening of the skin. Obviously, the the sensitivity, the discomfort on the area. What's the underlying anatomy looking like there? What are some considerations when you're looking at that?
So anytime we have ecchymosis or we have bruising, that just means that we have received some type of trauma. Generally, it's blunt. It can be penetrating, depending on what's happening. And the tissue has ruptured. The cells have ruptured, and the little capillaries have broken apart. And so it allows the blood that's supposed to be contained in these vessels to just free flow in between these cells. And that's what you're looking at. The bruise is the blood that has traveled into this space. Now it's no longer a part of the vasculature. It's not being reabsorbed. So it's dark in nature and it is in this area. Since you have cellular destruction, generally pain accompanies it. And then you'll notice after it goes on a couple of days into a week, it starts turning yellow and green, and then the cells repair themselves. And then eventually you have no problems and there's nothing to worry about there. Now, it can point a picture to there being other things that are happening and even deeper injuries that are occurring. We start getting into things like hematomas. We start getting into things like contusions, which can cause a deeper tissue damage. Now, on the base level, if you have bruising and you were talking about a muscular skeletal type of injury, very simple. You go back to the whole Rice's effect, right? The rest, the ice, the compression, the elevation, and the splinting on things like that. We're doing multiple things. You rest it because any type of insult obviously needs rest to keep it from aggravating. You need ice because we are trying to cause, vasoconstriction, and we're trying to reduce the actual swelling to the area. We want compression because we can actually compress the tissue and cause swelling to push out of it and go back into the vasculature. And then the elevation obviously keeps the large blood flow from going into it and pooling. And then splinting, I highly recommend. The art of splinting is very something that, even I see it's not very well taught or whatever. And I teach all of my people that you need to splint anything that is red, swollen, deformed, or painful. You do not know the underlying effect of the injury, and until proven otherwise with imagery and very intense exploration, we need to assume that it is broken or damaged. And to move it and to put pressure on it will continue to aggravate and cause further damage to that. So with that, that's just simple bruising. In the flesh, it is what it is. You've probably had some type of contact. However, if you want to look at more significant mechanisms of injury, then we can start looking into things like the head. If you see bruising around the eyes, that is something that is called our raccoon eyes, right? That can mean that we have some type of head injury that has caused bleeding inside of the head. It could be a basilar skull fracture or a cribriform plate fracture, and that blood is now flowing in there. Now, generally, we're going to see much more aggressive signs, altered mental status, reduced, mental state, all those different things or whatever. And then you can also see battle signs, which is going to be that bruising behind the ear as well, where blood can pool there. That could be in conjunction with your head injuries, which if you look at your March algorithm, the H is going to stand for hypothermia and head wounds, right? And how to manage that. Now, the other thing is when we look at the torso, especially in our abdomen and our belly, a lot of abdominal injuries are not very sexy. We don't think much of them. We're like, yeah, whatever, you'll be fine, whatever. But there's a lot of death that can occur from abdominal injuries. And if you look especially around the actual belly button, the umbilicus, you can see bruising there. We call something that's colon sign right there. That would tell us that there is something that's going on where you could be free bleeding in the belly and in the separation of tissues in the abdominal region. That's where it comes to the surface, and we can see that the most, right? And then you look on the flanks, you look at your gray Turner sign, and that kind of stuff can signify that there's bleeding going on. So it may not just be soft tissue damage at the surface. It may signify other more complicated things that are taking place. But separating the bruising to the contusion and to the hematoma, The contusion is going to be a large amount of swelling in those tissues that's damaged, and it could involve bruising as well. Hematoma, or excuse me, contusions can happen all over the body. If you've ever hit, especially something the hard surface like bone or something, you can see a big pocket of swelling as well, that happens there. And then the other, your hematomas. A hematoma is a collection of pooling blood under the skin. It's much more aggressive than a bruise. You actually have blood that just will sit there, and it almost looks like jelly if you were to cut it out and pull it out. And so obviously that can cause issues like infection, muscle damage, tissue damage, all that other kind of stuff as well in those areas. But the biggest thing when you're dealing with bruising is try to determine if there's something that's more severe underlying the effect, how having a high index of suspicion, right? Looking at mechanism of injury and determining and saying, hey, how bad was that hit? And do we think that something is much deeper that's going on that we need to try? If it's something that's superficial, go back to your RICEs, manage it with something as simple as, anti-inflammatories, NSAIDs, Motrin, all that good stuff, and continue to treat it like a sports injury almost, if you will, to manage it in the end. So.
And would timetable have a factor to play
I'm sorry,
when you're looking at?
say that again.
Sorry. Sorry. So would timetable, time factor have something to play in when you're trying to discern whether you're looking at hematoma or just a normal run-of-the-mill ecchymosis?
Yeah, I believe so. And the reason being is because, certain types of hematomas are going to be, more significant, especially when we start looking at like head injuries and stuff like that, right? Now, I could strike my cheek or fall and have, ecchymosis or bruising of the face or whatever. But when we look at the hematomas, we can actually have, especially in the head, deeper injuries. When you look at subarachnoid hemorrhages, right, and you look at subdural hemorrhages and all those things, you've got to think your brain has vasculature in it, has arteries and venules and veins and all that kind of stuff. And the blood that's in those veins is not supposed to just flow into the brain tissue. It's separated between, the cerebral spinal fluid and the meninges and the actual paths of blood flow. So anytime that we see that occur and we cause that rupture, it will cause the damage of that brain tissue as well. So anytime we have an individual who has head injury, has bruising, they are altered, they don't know their time, person, place, event, they're lethargic or whatever, that should be a very much cause of concern for us on that. Now, when we're talking about just musculoskeletal damage of individuals between bruising and hematoma, unfortunately in the field, there's not going to be a lot that we're going to be able to do to treat versus differentiate what's going on, there. We need to make sure that hematoma has occurred, that we're not developing things like compartment syndrome, and that we're not having compromise of the tissue around it. Because obviously at the deep end of the spectrum, we're looking at, as simple as having pain and having a manageable effect, to looking at things like what is called rhabdomyolysis and having cellular breakdown of tissue. And that is going to kill the kidneys and kind of moving in that direction with it. So.
Head injuries typically kind of harder to uh, discern between like hematoma and bruising just because of how badly any wound to the head tends to bleed.
So yeah, and that's the thing, and I really am big on this, and I teach my people that the art of the physical assessment. You need to be touching these people, you need to be looking, listening, trying to figure out and using diagnostics to confirm what you already know. And I see it a lot. I see it in pre-hospital. I see it in hospital. A medic or a doctor will look at someone and say, "Okay, well, let's see what the imagery says," versus coming up with a differential diagnosis and trying to match that from there. Now, with the head itself, if you're looking at the exterior of the head, the scalp, the face, all these regions, yes, there is a lot of vasculature there. You cut the scalp, you cut the face, generally you will see a lot of bleeding. However, that is mostly superficial unless you hit some of the arteries that run into the face and the head. But a lot of times, simple direct pressure will stop that bleeding of that zone because they are not massive, arteries that are there. Inside of the actual head, obviously we go into the cranium and below. We have to understand that our brain stem, and our spinal cord are encased. They are very special. They are inside of this packaging that's called the meninges, and they are encased in a fluid that's called cerebrospinal fluid. And that fluid is not supposed to mix with anything else. Blood is not supposed to go into that space at all. It is kept sealed in like different chambers, if you will, as it happens. So anytime we have a deep head injury that will cause, any type of a cerebral arterial bleed, subarachnoid hemorrhage, subdural hemorrhage, all that kind of stuff, the blood can cross over that blood-brain barrier. And if that occurs, that blood will be necrotic to brain tissue, meaning that it will kill brain tissue. And a lot of times those injuries are permanent. If you look at individuals who have strokes, there's two different types of strokes. Mostly it is going to be something that is a block or an infarction, and it's going to be a hemorrhage. And if you look at those two different types of strokes, the hemorrhage is the one that is most lethal to those patients because blood goes into the area. It creates something called a penumbra. They have to actually cut that necrotic tissue out to try to save it. And once the damage is done, the damage is done to that individual. So I highly recommend in the physical assessment of these patients, especially when imagery is not available and you're trying to manage them. Anytime we have a head injury, we need to look at the light end of the spectrum, which is going to be an individual who has altered mental status, right? They're not themselves, they're lethargic, all these things that are occurring, up into the point where we start looking at much more severe symptoms that will occur. A lot of times if we have what is called intracranial pressure, which we understand the head itself is encased and it has its own pressure there. If that pressure spikes and our cerebral perfusion pressure changes, the body will change, right? Because all the decision making is coming from this zone. And if we're putting that pressure in there, then we can start developing that increased intracranial pressure where the patient will begin to vomit. They will begin to throw up projectile. We can look at the eyes and we can see two different pupil sizes because the pressure is pushing on retinal nerves to cause that to occur, even to the point where it progresses. To think about it, you're inside of this skull. There's only so much room. If it's swelling, what happens to the brain and the brainstem? There's nowhere for it to go except for an outlet. In the bottom of your skull, in that foramen magnum, you have a hole. And that hole is where that brainstem passes and becomes the spinal cord. And if that brain is swelling, it will start pushing that larger brainstem through that hole in something that's called herniation. And in that place of that brainstem is where our primal things are. Everything that controls breathing, getting up into our pituitary glands, getting up into all all those areas that will control the body functions. And then a lot of times what we see are individuals, especially if you see this, if you want to look up what is called Cushing symptoms, where an individual would develop irregular respirations, they will developing a widening pulse pressure, and they will become bradycardic, means their heart rate will slow down. And a lot of times with these patients, if we see them in the field with a head injury or neurological damage, and we start seeing those symptoms, this is probably a pre-terminal event for them. That means they're probably about to die, especially in the accompaniment of what is called posturing. And in posturing, we'll see an individual either develop decorticate or decerebrate posturing, where their hands and their legs will either turn towards the body, decorticate, or turn away from the body and decerebrate. And generally, that is a pre-terminal event for them at that time. They're going to die very quickly after that because that brainstem is literally going through that smaller area and being pressed. There's nowhere else for it to go. So that's a very,
like you said, it's a very primal thing. So it's
that's
very last.
That's right.
Last course. I've only seen it once clinically, and it's
Yep. And generally, they don't make it to the hospital. If we see them in the field, we're probably going to have a traumatic arrest before we even get to a facility, just because that's going to be a very bad outcome, completely. So.
Yeah. But, once again, thinking of the anatomy and physiology, right? So thinking of head injuries, thinking of the brain, right? So your vision, your speech, your motor function, like you mentioned, vomiting, looking at like Perla, like you said, make sure that the pupils are equal, that your eyes track, you don't have a bad nurse. I don't remember the terminology, but you don't have the shake when you're going to your laterals. And
like your ataxia and all that kind of stuff.
Thank you.
Nystagmus, yeah.
Yeah. But yeah, so once again, very important to know your anatomy and what to look for there.
And I highly recommend, man, even if you're not interested in medical, go buy an anatomy book, because if you're a gunfighter, if you think you're going to kill somebody without knowing what's in their body, you're wrong. You need to know what to hit. You need to know what to smoke. And if that, if that means studying it for that reason alone, that will show you all the things that you need to, encompass. And to me, hurting someone and harming someone is just two sides of the coin. Knowing one makes you better at the other. If that, in some weird way, if that makes sense to you, it definitely helps me to separate them out and understand the difference between the two. So,
100%. It's actually a project that we're currently working on, is making a set of targets that are stackable, that you can place on a standard USPSA target.
Nice.
So that people can be learning this underlying anatomy.
That's great.
As they're training other things.
That's great. Yeah. One of the mottos with Selous is hunt, harm, heal.
Awesome.
You have to be equal in all these things, to succeed, in the end. So.
Hey everybody, this is 6 and 7 with the Hard Time Strongman podcast, and we are coming to talk to you about our Patreon and Discord.
Hey guys, our patrons get early access to all of our episodes. They get all of our exclusive pre and post shows, all of our spicy takes, all of our rabbit holes that we go on, everything that we want to include in an episode, but we can't because we need to stay on topic. And soon enough, we will be offering digital downloads, guides, everything that we've been working on in the background will soon be available to our patrons. So make sure to check it out.
And come hang out with us on Discord. Speaking of the spicy stuff, this is where we discuss most of it. Once you're there, you'll get access to all of our in-depth discussions, including stuff like homesteading, fieldcraft, medical, camping, communications, shooting. You like ARs? Come talk to us about it. You like 4x4 vehicles and prepping? Come talk to us about it.
You like tannerite, thermite, napalm? Come talk to us about it. All of the campfire talks that would get us kicked off of other platforms, it's right there in our Discord. Come join our community.
We're active on Discord every day. We're interacting with members constantly. We have guys from every walks of life coming to contribute their expertise to all of these various fields and subjects that we've been talking about.
Come join the Discord. Come join the Discord. Join our community. Build up that better class of man. Now back to the episode. Sorry, I really like that one. I wanted to write that down.
It's all good, man.
So musculoskeletal, so fractures and dislocations.
Yep.
So you mentioned fracture, you mentioned splinting, but we have compound fractures, we have internal fractures. What do people mean to be looking at here? Because we come from a lot of our listeners have a lot of different contexts, right? So you have your family men with rough and tumble boys. You have 20 somethings who are out. Who knows what the hell they're doing. You have fighters who are going to be seeing more of this stuff. But what's your word on that?
So when we talk about fractures, we have to understand which part of the body has received the damage. If we're talking about just an isolated arm fracture, that's one thing. That's soft tissue damage or whatever. But if we have a fracture of the skull, right, then we're looking at a multi-system approach to what's going on there. Now, when it comes to simple things like, say, for instance, extremities and long bone fractures and all that stuff, those are more simple to manage for us. We have some type of mechanism that comes into contact with that extremity. The bone cannot move faster than the physics are involved, and we will imply damage to that. One of the things that a lot of individuals need to understand is that bone is not just static, dead tissue. Bone is living. Bone, it will grow. Bone will multiply. Bone will actually use its own vasculature. There are veins and arterioles that go throughout the bones, right? That's how we pump things, we process things, we do it. You have red marrow and white marrow and all these things, and yellow marrow even inside of these cavities. And that some bones, whenever they break, will actually have a large amount of bleeding in the cavity from that bone fracturing. So the thing is that to understand short-term effects, long-term effects. Short-term effects are going to be, say, for instance, that mid-femur fracture. that pelvic fracture, you can lose a lot of blood through these fractures, from a liter to a liter and a half in this area. Obviously, that may transmit to a person presenting as a shocky type patient. That's a lot of blood loss for them. So with that, we'll have a lot of musculoskeletal damage in the area, and then how to fix that long term. But when, we can even get to the point where we start moving away from that and we start talking about just regular bone fractures and how they work, is that we think of, the actual nerve damage, the loss of circulation to the end of the extremity and how that works. There's something that's called PMS that we use, and that's pulse motor sensation. So anytime we have an individual we feel like a damage or something that's going on, we need to go to the extremities, and we need to go to the arms, and we go down to the wrists. We need to take that radial pulse. We need to say, look at the fingers and say, hey, can you feel this? Do you have sensation? Is there any numbness going on, whatever? Down to the feet, the pedal pulse, the toes or whatever. Because if we have a loss of PMS, that means that fracture, which, we talk about those pipes from Lowe's that are inside of that wall, if that main joist or that beam has shifted and pressed upon some of these areas, it may stop the sensation or the blood from flowing past it, and it can cause permanent damage to the rest of the extremity. So, I highly recommend that we learn the art of splinting. And, if something called a SAM splint is not part of your gear, I'd highly recommend making it. It rolls up. It's got a semi-rigid core to it. You can do all different types of things with it.
They're magic.
Yeah, they're great. My number one use of a SAM splint is insane, but it's actually to open an airway. I place it behind the occiput, put someone in a sniffing position or a tripod, or excuse me, a sniffing position, and open an airway and use it for advanced or basic airway management with them. You can use it as a C-collar. You can take it around behind, then cross over to the top and stabilize a cervical injury in the field if you need it to. There's so many uses that come with them. But
they pack down super small too.
Very small, very lightweight. Very small, very lightweight. So they're great. But yeah, anything that you have, like I said, that's red, swollen, deformed, or painful, I highly recommend splinting that area. And you need to check that PMS before and after splinting to make sure you have not splint it in a manner that will cause loss of circulation or function to that limb that occurs. And there's different types of fractures. Obviously, we have fractures that are still in place, so to speak, in layman's terms, that is just broken and it stays right there. And then we have fractures that break and they shift dramatically, even puncture through the skin. And that's where we get into our old compound fractures or our open fractures, which leads to a lot more muscular damage, opening for infection, all these different things or whatever. Trying to fix that fracture in the field is very difficult. Trying to reduce it or putting it back into place without imagery is very difficult because we don't know what lines up where. We don't know tendon, ligament, vascular damage that's been done. That can be hard for us. And the same thing that happens for dislocations. Anytime we look at a joint injury that's occurred, our knees, our shoulders, our elbows, all these locations there, the same thing happens with them. That is just a joint where two bones have come together, have shifted, because of impact or mechanism there. Same thing with them. They can be very simple. I often see, dislocations or subluxations that are very simple in nature. They do not have ligament damage, tendon damage. There's no problem with them, but they need imagery to confirm that a lot of times. And then a doctor will sedate them and just, reduce that, put certain amount of tension in certain areas to pull and right back together where it was. And those are things you can learn to do in the field. However, there is a risk with that. Without knowing exactly what's going on under the surface, you can cause more permanent damage by attempting to do that, but it's not a bad idea to learn the basics of how to do that, because if you are in an in extremis situation where you have no choice, what are you going to do? Have a teammate that just has a dislocated shoulder forever? That's a conversation you're generally going to have and say, I can do more damage. I can help it. What do you want to do? We can actually reduce it now and have the chance to fix this and keep on moving. So
I actually had to do that with my boy. It was the weirdest thing ever. We were playing in our backyard and he was running around and he hit a pothole they didn't see. Mm-hmm. His right leg went down a little bit, farther than his left super hard. and he just fell down. And kids are super finicky.
Sure.
So like sometimes they won't even tell you they're in any pain. But he got up, he tried to walk, and he fell down again. And I'm from like across the yard looking, I'm like, oh no.
Yeah.
that's not normal. He gets up again, tries to walk, and he falls back down. It's like, oh crap. So I went, man, he must have been 2 or 3 at the time. But I went, I grabbed him, I laid him down, and I just, put him through a normal just range of motion. I stood back up, and he went off and ran around.
Sure.
It's like, dude, that's not fun. Stop it.
That is definitely right. And even, long-term management, once we have a patient, especially our adolescent and adult patients that have a dislocation, a lot of times tendons and ligaments will stretch, meaning that they are more susceptible next time for that bone to misalign and for it to occur in there. And a lot of us, especially, any mill guys or any dudes who have spent a lot of stress, a lot of times, you can feel, if I sit here and make a range of motion, I feel that shoulder clunk back and forth. That clunking is coming from the ligaments and tendons that are now loose. It's not held together. That rotator cuff is showing, hey, there's wear and tear there. And we can look at the possibility with the right impact, it will dislocate. So it's always something to think about,
You'll be all right, 6.
Take
a breather, man.
Everybody's getting super hypochondriac all of a sudden. They're like,
yeah,
this is hurting over here.
I'm not even rotating my
out.
shoulder, and I can just feel the pain in it. I'm like, God.
Yeah.
Just remember every time I do
Click.
a push-up, my shoulders click.
Yep.
It's like, dang it.
That's normal. It's just keeping count. That's all it is. So.
Oh yeah, I love it.
Oh man.
So same vein, sprains and strains.
Yeah. So
the
biggest thing to remember with them is if you look at sprain and you look at strain, basically your biggest difference is the P in sprain is for pain, and then the T in strain is for tendon. And a lot of times when we're trying to realize a lot of the things, like some of our patients, I can't tell if they have a dislocated ankle or broken ankle versus a strain or a sprain or what's going on there, And so a lot of times with these patients that, may have a sprain or something like that, they may have a longer recovery than an individual with, a broken ankle, just because of tendons healing and all that other kind of stuff. Most of your strains, them being muscular in nature, we can easily, that's a pulled muscle. We can use, anti-inflammatories. We can use ice and we can use heat. The ice is going to reduce inflammation. The heat is going to encourage blood flow to incorporate healing that goes with that. When we get into a sprain, however, a lot of times tendon and ligament will be pulled, stretched, or damaged, and it will take much longer, even up to 6 to 8 weeks, for them to really get back to where they're supposed to be on that concept. So we have to be able to manage that, figure out what's going on with it, and understand. And we want to be hardcore, and we want to keep on going, and we want to walk on it or whatever. It's not going to help. It's going to make it worse. Sometimes you just have to stay put, and you have to let it heal and then kind of move forward, with that. So
I was going to say, that's if your patient, if your casualty is actually going along with your plan of care.
That's right.
If they're actually, following your care plan
and that's
doing everything you want them to do, which a lot of time they won't.
That's a great, honestly, and I can't believe we haven't talked about that yet, but that is something that I wanted to get to. Whatever your reason, whatever your mission is, whatever you're doing, whatever your buddies are, whatever, if you don't have somebody in your circle that is medically trained, you need to go get somebody. And not just, okay, I've got, my guy over here, he took a CLS class back in the mid 2000s, and, he's pretty good at tourniquets or whatever. You need to get something more than that. It's going to take more than that in the end. And you need to try to align yourself with individuals who have been medics, individuals with critical care experience, mid-levels, PAs, nurse practitioners, even doctors or whatever, because you're going to need that kind of stuff, and you need to be able to recreate that long-term stuff. Not to mention the fact that, I'm not saying that they do this and that they would do this, obviously, but individuals with licensing, with their ability to access pharmacology, and to be able to, possibly gather certain things ahead of time and to have that going on.
Mhm.
So
Well, or people who are close to a certain border, or honestly, you can get a lot of equipment. Um, obviously, this isn't the gold standard, but folks who work in and with animals.
oh yeah, for sure.
A lot of interventions, a lot of supply can be dual purpose there.
That's exactly right.
But
And the FDA does not regulate a lot of stuff that is for animal use. But it's made out of the same compound. It is made within the
mhm.
same tolerances of effectiveness, and it just says for animal use, not for human use on there. So,
But you'll
um,
never know that if you don't have critical thinking skills, if you don't have the thought process to actually go through and double check all of those tolerances, all of those ingredients, everything else. If you don't have the inclination, you're going to do it and you don't know.
that's
That's
ex-
a resource that's completely lost to you.
I agree 100% with that.
But to your point just a second ago, the more I learn in medical care, the more I am aware of what I don't know. I
Yes.
picked up a book in this past year, Where There Is No Doctor, and just thinking holistically, if you do not have the infrastructure, if you do not have the support that we currently have now, it's such a daunting such a daunting task, and then to think if you don't have someone who at least has a basic understanding of medical, I mean, what a monster to try to undertake with nothing.
That's exactly right. And just like you said, here a second ago, if you've never heard of Where There Is No Doctor or Where There Is No Dentist, that needs to be books that are going into your Amazon cart or whatever right now. You need to have those. Ditch Medicine, all these others, even the Ranger Medical Head book. There's lots of things that need to go into that area. A lot of times, locally, you can find fire departments who are offering emergency first responder or basic EMT or EMTB programs that you can go take. Sometimes they're even paid for. If you want to become a volunteer
Yeah,
firefighter, I highly recommend doing that because just the education that goes and the understanding of first responder world that happens there and just absorbing that
the community.
information. Yeah, getting that experience, to do that. But you're absolutely right. When you look at not having that infrastructure in place and how to replicate that and how to do it, obviously there comes a point in time where we want to have all of the knowledge and capability of modern medicine at our hands. We want to have labs, we want to have testing, we want to have imagery and all that kind of stuff because that would let us know 100% what we're dealing with and this and that. But still, that's even practicing medicine. We see those people make mistakes all the time. But then the understanding is that we even move into, different layers where we start saying, okay, well, here's the deal. I know that I need this, this, and this. However, I have done an incremental amount of studying about medicinal plants. And I know which works to do this, what works to help this. That's information that needs to supplement that at that point, to learn how do we do this for the last how many thousands of years without med schools and all that kind of stuff involved in treating patients and doing it. You go back and look at the Bubishi and you look at Chinese medicine from thousands of years ago and things that they were doing. It does create a well-rounded approach to treatment and to care over time. So it definitely is not something that you're going to go take one class on and be Doogie Howser or whatever. You definitely need a lot more exposure and experience with it to treat all kind
Right.
of things. So
Well, and something else I love, like you mentioned, is just that old school medicine. You see all these old, dudes, all these old farm hands, all these old farmers who, they've been out in that field for 20, 30 years. And they've gotten injuries. Think they've ever been to the hospital?
my my
Nope.
my grandpa, man, when I was a kid, he used to keep a glass jar. I think it was like an old Dr. Pepper bottle. It was real small, oval shape. It was the early '90s, late '80s, and that's how they came with a plastic top back then. And it was full of kerosene and had a rag in the top of it. And we were working out in the yard or whatever, and I cut my hand one day on a piece of tin. And he's like, "Yeah, yep, come here." Took kerosene, put it in there, and I'm like, "What is this?" And he's like, "It's going to kill the bacteria so you don't get tetanus and lockjaw
Jesus.
off of it." Now,
Awesome.
Did it work? I don't know. I'm still alive. It could be chance or whatever. But it's there's so many things that we've done for. Doesn't mean it's right. It doesn't mean it's wrong. It takes some studying and seeing. But there's all different types of approaches to different things, and it's pretty wild. So
Yeah. Speaking of wild, a lot of our listeners like to lick outlets or try to stick forks in electrical outlets. So we should probably talk about electric shock management of that.
yes, 100%. So
That comes with a whole other host of
it
issues.
does. It does. Now there's two different things. There is electrocution. Electrocution means to die by way of electric current, right? So when you say someone has been electrocuted, that means they actually die. If they are still alive, that means they've been shocked. Is how that works. Now, what we need to understand is that electricity is very hard to predict in the path that it moves. Okay, there's no guarantee that it's going to go from point A to point B. Like if you see an exposed wire, you may see an arc, right? It goes to the open air between point A and point B. You said, damn, I didn't know it would do that. I thought it was just going to go across the wire. So there's a whole lot of electrical principles and physical scientific principles that go with that, ohms, resistance, conductance, all that good stuff. However, what we do know is that when a human body comes into contact with voltage, that voltage can conduct through that body. It now becomes the conduit. The problem is that electricity is not very kind to tissue. So we are obviously understanding that we are worried about, getting electrocuted and going into cardiac arrest because it affects the cardiac tissue and the electrical, properties of the actual cardiac tissue, like individuals that get struck by lightning and all that kind of stuff. But the problem is that you can be shocked and still have massive damage to the body. And the reason being is if you think about that arc and you think about the electricity going from point A to point B, well, if I touch something, or if I touch, say, for instance, one hand or whatever, electricity enters my body, it may want to exit my body at some point, right? Or ground itself against something. That means that electricity, as it travels through the meat, can actually create a wound channel through that area as a conduit. And if we think about what comes with electricity, a lot of times heat is the byproduct of that. So as it moves through that tissue, it can literally cook everything in that wound channel as it travels through. So the problem with electricity is that we don't know the extent of damage from the outside a lot of times. We may see a burn in an opening here, and then somewhere down here, a burn in an opening there. That electricity has traveled through that area, and we do not know what is damaged because of that. A lot of times we treat these patients as burn patients. That's the secret, because literally what has happened is they have been burned through the inside. So if we talk about our fluid resuscitation for our burn patients and whatever, if you go back and you look at the consensus formula, the ones that have been, shocked with electricity are having the highest amount of fluid resuscitation that goes with them because we simply do not know what that wound channel looks like until we see further imagery and all that kind of stuff that comes with it. So if you're shocked, if you have that entrance area, you have that exit area, you need to start looking for secondary symptoms, right? Pain, swelling, any type of other organ compromise that's taking place at that point, and you're going to have to treat it from there. It's almost like being burned from the inside out is what you would be looking at. So
Definitely one of the scariest methods of injury, just because of the unknown.
sure, 100%.
Yeah. Wild. So, biting or bite injuries, animal and human. I think most everyone, should know the bacteria present in the mouth, right? And so you have the obvious risk of infection. You have the obvious, puncture injury. But is there any specific management that you can think that would, I guess, tidbits on that managing bites that you can think of?
Punctures are tough, and the reason being is when we talk about a puncture, we have a generally a smaller cylindrical type of injury that goes deep into a tissue and then comes back out of a tissue. It's different from a laceration because it is that deep channel. with that deep channel, a lot of times traps bacteria, fungal, viral, whatever it may be. Infection can ensue because we don't get good circulation. It can't drain well. Because if you notice a lot of wounds, they like to drain. That's a natural healing aspect for things. But when it's deep tissue, it doesn't want to. So for that, yes, we do have problems. Mouths are pretty disgusting. There is bacteria, viral, fungal even. You don't know what you're getting into. Communicable diseases, even with individuals, whenever we get bit by humans. And then obviously animals, we don't know what they're the vector or the host of. They may have all kind of stuff that we can obviously get from being bit by them. So the biggest thing is going to be the point of contact care, washing out the wound, warm soapy water if you can get it, wrapping it, then watching the healing aspect of it. A lot of times if we had our ways and our wishes, we would start prophylactic antibiotics on them. We would go ahead and get it into them starting off just in case. But a lot of times we don't have the ability for that. So we're kind of left in limbo. We have limited resources. We only have so many antibiotics, and I can't just give it to you if I don't see an infection or whatever, versus a risk to reward. So my recommendation is judge the depth of it the best that you can, clean it the best you can, wrap it, and treat it like other wounds as far as that's considered. But with any other wound, expect infection at some point. This is why, just as a whole, the healthier that you are, the better you are equipped to fighting off infection. Okay. So, if you have like a BMI of 46 and you don't do anything to maintain good health, more than likely you are going to succumb to infection. There are going to be problems that happen there. Diabetes, other things. If you look at diabetes and you look at individuals that form from that, high blood sugar or high glucose levels cause a decrease in healing application, right? Infections are worse. Infections generally cause worse diabetic issues, that go hand in hand with each other. So trying to stay ahead of the curve with that kind of thing is going to be huge. I know it's difficult in austere environments because what we can get as far as nutrition, we need to start thinking about that. I can't emphasize enough that health and care and medicine is much more than a tourniquet or a gauze. It starts with, what am I putting in my body? What is my nutrition? What is my sleep cycle? What are all of my underlying issues that I can try to affect? Because, there's 100%, like even right now, we're seeing a rise back in the spicy coof. The COVID is coming back around in my area, but a lot of people, we're not wearing masks, right? And that's a whole nother conversation about mask and everything anyways and all that kind of stuff. And the fact of the matter is I trust my immune system. I've given it what it needs. I eat what I'm supposed to, I exercise, I do the things I need to, and I come in contact with disease all the time. It doesn't make me any less careless or any more careful. I just trust at the end of the day, my immune system is going to do what it's supposed to do. With anything we deal with as far as injuries and long-term medical applications, this is a problem because that's getting away from the trauma and getting away to the medical. You're out in an austere environment for a long period of time. You don't have fresh foods. You don't have, fruits and vegetables that you can only eat canned foods for so long because the vitamins, minerals, and everything's cooked out of them. You're going to need replenishment in those ways. You're going to have to get fresh things. You look at the old, sailors and scurvy and all that kind of stuff because they weren't carrying fruit. Then they had to look at lemon juice and orange juice and all that kind of stuff to maintain long-term health. Same principle applies to our situations with that. So
Your health also affects your baseline.
100%.
So if you have a solid baseline, then if you have an underlying issue going on, it's a lot easier to pinpoint and to diagnose than if you're just a freaking dumpster fire out the door.
Yep, 100%. Because a lot of these patients who have very poor health, they don't just have one thing wrong. They have all things wrong. It's a needle in a stack of needles with them, and you're trying to fix one thing and then the other thing is running off the charts with them. And that's a very common practice in the modern world with most of our patients. So.
Well, not to mention pharmacology as well. If you have a host of underlying issues, then what happens when your pharmacology runs out.
That's right. I think about that often. I see patients who are on oxygen. I see patients who are on insulin. I see patients who, have to have this. And I'm like, if the power shut off right now, how long do you have? How long do you have realistically, before you see?
Have you ever read 1 second out or 1 second after?
I
Sorry
have.
for
No, no,
interrupting
no.
you.
Yeah, of course. No, yeah, I have for sure.
Absolutely, terrified me. I was very bothered after finishing that book because it's just like, oh my goodness, I've never read a book that had to put it in such perspective.
Yes,
Yeah,
very much so.
yeah, and that's what, and he was so diligent. It's like, oh yeah, everybody who was on heart medication and liver medication died within the first
Yep.
month,
Real
essentially.
real world application is, years ago, when I was in the service, we were sent to Katrina whenever it happened. And you have these
Mm,
individuals who are, for all intents and purposes, they're marooned with no resupply on pharmacology, oxygen, all these different
wow.
things, and things that could be avoided, these individuals would die from. So to say that you don't have to believe in whatever, right? Because it's such a broad spectrum of things. You don't have to believe in the end times or, civil unrest or whatever. There are historical aspects that have happened of all of us. We're like, yeah, but you would be wrong. This has happened. This can happen. And certain things like that show us, 100%. And the things, I'll be honest with you, even from being overseas, the things that I experienced in Katrina frightens me more than what I saw overseas. Just the response,
Mm,
just how society functions, how they fall apart. It's like seeing Lord of the Flies
Yeah.
in real time. And it's a very, very interesting thing that I think a lot of people have not unpacked historically to really dive into it. I would recommend, if you want to know what, day 5 without power looks like, go ahead and go look at that example right there. If you think you're going to be good to go and that your neighbors are going to be loving and support you and all that kind of stuff, go look at that situation right there. If you think that the guy that you've known for several years and that you drink beers with on the weekend, you grill with, that you guys are good to go, and he has a hungry son and a daughter who he can't put food in their mouth, and if you think that he won't clap you at the first chance to not watch his kids die, you're wrong. So, you need to start thinking about these things, and you need to start studying human behavior and see how it plays out into these things. Because when people are pushed into a corner, they will do whatever they need to do and they will become that animal. And you need to know how to deal with that, and you need to know how to expect what's going to occur with that.
Not to
So,
mention the fact that so many people think that the government's just going to help them and there's just going to be a stream of resources. I mean, all you have to do is point to Katrina to see how wildly mismanaged that was.
yeah, the government is really good at helping people if what you mean is the complete
Yep.
opposite of that in every single occasion throughout history. You look at Hurricane Sandy and FEMA, ran out of water within 36 hours. That's your only job. The only job is to provide these things and have it happen. We saw it, there in Katrina, and I don't blame them. We had cops, we had firefighters, we had EMTs, we had all these people who left to go home and take care of their family. I would have done the same exact thing. Burn the city. I'll take care of my tribe. I don't
Yep.
care what happens at that point. However, what we realize is that the government response of the state, the federal, whatever, was not there. And what was there was absolutely days and weeks behind in mobilization. That's why the military had to be sent to intervene very rapidly in what was going on. We had no idea what was going on in these places. That's why the military was sent forward very rapidly to provide assessments, reconnaissance, intelligence on what was taking place in these areas, and then obviously to mobilize the logistics of response and rescue and all these other applications there. So, yeah, you're absolutely right. And that's like I tell people in public safety. If you think that when you ring the phone for 911 and that somebody is coming to you and they're going to be the consummate professional to save you or your family, you are wrong. My motto at the end of the day is no one is coming to save you. It's up to you. You have to prepare to self rescue at any joint, any point in time, any venture. You've got
Yep.
to take care of you and your own. So
100%. I mean, even something as small as 2021 in Texas.
yep,
We were caught without power for 4 days, and there was no help to be seen. I mean, you're talking about ice sheet ice sheet over like 3 layers of ice on all the roads, and you can't blame Texas. It hasn't happened in 100 years.
that's right.
Why in the world would they keep that kind of infrastructure to be able to handle that?
That's right.
But you can't look outwards. You need to you need to be handling this on your own. Like you said, what was it, 30 seconds out, their motto, no one's coming, it's up to us. Like you said, prepare to self-rescue.
That's right.
If you can't manage it yourself, between you and yours, then you're, you need to fix that.
That's exactly right.
So my last 2 points I had here. So we had amputation and foreign body injuries.
Yeah.
So amputation, that's a lot to do with massive hemorrhaging. So obviously the tourniquet, obviously the conversion of the tourniquet, worried about infection, worried about management, but obviously if you are on your own, you do not have the resources, you don't have that the gold standard that you'd be hoping and praying for. But what are your 2 cents on that?
So amputations are extremely difficult to manage. You're right. Immediate threat, we're going to talk about hemorrhage control and stopping that. But long-term care, you're talking about a nightmare. A lot of times with controlled amputations, we want to be able to cut into and shorten the bone and then create skin flaps that are longer so that we can then encase the edge of it and then close it up around it. We don't want exposed bone because bone is live, like I talked about earlier. And if it's exposed to the air around it, it will become necrotic and die. And when we see just a repetitive amount of death of tissue necrosis and then continue to amputate up and up and up and up until it's just systemic and we die. So if you're dealing with an amputation, that's going to be a very, very, very hard wound to manage, over time without really big support. I'm not saying it's impossible because we've done it in the past. You look at the Civil War and amputation seemed to be like the first line of defense on everything. But, it's who makes it and who dies according to what their health is and what the circumstances are and back and forth. It's anybody's bet at that point in time on who's going to make it, with that. And then obviously what we're talking about, with our last one, is that, we have to be able to understand, and when we have any type of foreign body in us, whether that is an object, or whether it is an animal, parasite, or whatever, we have to think about, number one, how do we safely remove it? If you have a larger foreign body that is inside of us, like a penetration or whatever, you're rolling the dice. The only time that we teach, especially in pre-hospital medicine, that if you remove a penetrating object is if it gets in the way of CPR or it gets in the way of airway. That's when you can remove it because it's in extremis at that point in time. And it's probably not a good chance at that point to save the person. But, without imagery, without seeing what it's stuck into and what's damaged underneath, we run the risk. It can be applying occlusion to an artery. And when we pull that out, you will massively bleed, from there, up until even the small stuff, a splinter, a thorn or whatever, causing infection, deep puncture wounds and all that kind of stuff that comes with it. I do know that if, like say, for instance, simple things like hydrogen peroxide, right? If you have hydrogen peroxide in your medical gear, I highly recommend you discard that. That's not going to help you. Hydrogen peroxide will kill viable tissue just as equally as it kills bacteria in the tissue. So it will not cause a great healing process to occur there. We need more selective things like antibiotics, all that kind of stuff to fix what's going on in that tissue. So a lot of times just pulling it, using antibiotic cream, if we have Neosporin or we have anything like that, that will help out with these things. Allowing things to drain, say for instance, you can buy suture kits. I don't know if you guys or anyone listening knows that. You can go on Amazon right now and buy a suture kit. Comes with a practice pad, comes with the sutures and all that other kind of stuff. And you can practice it and you can actually do it and become good at it. The problem is learning how that works in the full scale of healing. Some wounds are so deep that we have to go to the bottom of the wound and suture and then come to the top of the wound and then suture and create a channel. And then obviously understanding the need for maybe wanting a drain in there, like a rosette, to allow that fluid that builds to come out and not create a pocket and create infection there is going to be big. So, also understanding too, 6 hours is a pretty good mark for a lot of these wounds as well. If you do not close a wound within 6 hours, something called, cell granulation or degranulation is going to occur. where the actual cells themselves will change their spectrum and their design, and they will start wanting to turn into scar tissue. So if you then go after 6 hours and try to close that wound up, it's scar tissue on scar tissue. It will not heal anymore, and it will then cause infection and just a festering wound after that. A lot of times, if it's post 6 hours, you have to come in and cut that outer layer of flesh off, debride it, and then reattach it to get it to do what it's supposed to do. So little things like that that you need to kind of keep your mind on when you're treating things long term is pretty key on that. So good set of tweezers. Any part of med kit, you can buy
Hemostats.
for sure. Yeah, hemostats. And I've got little surgical kit, that you can use. You can find in Army surplus or whatever, with a 10 blade, with a hemostat, with these different things, and you can do a lot with a kit like that over time. So
Yeah. That and steri strips. Steri strips I've seen used to pretty good effect as well.
for sure, definitely. And if you got friends that work in the ER, go talk to them. It's insane to think that a lot of nurses and a lot of people that work in the ER, a lot of medications, a lot of tools, a lot of stuff, they bill. They don't care if it gets used or not. They're billing the patient. It may still be in the package, and they're like, "Yeah, we're just tossing this in the trash."
Well, Lance, brother, we're approaching 2 hours now. Obviously, we had a lot of fun here. We'd love to have you back on.
Sure.
But to kind of close out, you talked about a few references. You referenced books called Ditch Medicine.
That's it.
Where There Is No Doctor, Where There Is No Dentist, and the Ranger Medic Handbook. Are there any other references you can think of for our listeners for their own further learning, where they can kind of pick up and start learning this stuff?
Well, to be honest with you, I could say, well, go online and Google this or Google that. The problem is it's like sipping out of a fire hose. There's just so much stuff. What I recommend doing, you can go on, thriftbooks.com or any of these, Amazon or whatever, go buy you like an EMT textbook. A lot of times you can buy them used, they're not that much, and you can get it and you can start just reading a little bit of a time or skimming some and start picking up information through them on basic care, basic anatomy, physiology, just anatomy books, textbooks, and all that kind of stuff, is pretty key on that. And that would be my biggest recommendations of where to start, at least on kind of how to get a working knowledge of what to do and how to do it, and kind of going from there, finding, going out and actually seeking training, getting involved with that kind of stuff. Even if it's basic stuff, go take a CPR course, go take a basic life support first aid, family first aid, whatever. That'll start getting you miles ahead on what's going on, to be able to get out and do stuff. And I know that's not sexy. I get it. 100% agree. It's not the deep end. It's not what you want to get involved with maybe. But again, when you become a master at that and you can start teaching people on that kind of stuff, well, let's talk about the other stuff and kind of how you can expand upon that, because all it's doing is just building that reference, all the way across. The better you are at those basic things, generally, the much better you are at the other things. I'm one of those people. I don't believe in a basic approach and an advanced approach. I believe in basic, building basic fundamentals, and then I believe at fundamentals at 200 miles an hour. And at the advanced application, everything I've seen in my experience is that it's just the basic stuff in the most impossible circumstances. And if you can do it, and maintain the simple things you've learned, generally you will have a much better chance of staying alive.
Listen,
So
you've said this many times. Some of this stuff's not sexy, but I know of one thing that's even less sexy than going to do in these classes: dying.
dying, 100%, 100%. Not many times you find a sexy corpse, and then if you do, then you have other issues that are going on.
Yeah, I was gonna say that's
might need to see a psychiatrist.
Yeah. So, yeah, exactly.
But our hope is to make it more attractive. Our hope is to make this the baseline. That's the whole point of this show. This whole point of our project is to train a better class of man, to raise the standard for in all these aspects. To rising tide raises all boats, right? So if we can raise the bar just a little bit, then that's exponential growth, not just for us but for our children.
I love
it's huge. It's a legacy.
I love it. And I would tell you, if you're listening out here, man, woman, whoever, you are intentionally made to feel like you are
Hmm.
by yourself right now. You are. Everything that you come in contact with, media, society, you feel like you are the oddball that you are, you're not. I promise you. I guarantee that you're not. Reach out, anytime that you can. I'm one of those people. I try to be available. Instagram, shameless plug, go to Selous Dynamics, look me up. Google Selous Dynamics, go to the website, email me, DM me. I try to respond to all DMs. If you just want to talk about things, you want to find out, hey, where can I get this? Where can I get that? I have people all the time say, hey, what was that book you were talking about? What is this? Whatever. And, come train. You want to take a class with us? That's great. You want to take a class with somebody else? I highly recommend it. I recommend going to take classes with everybody you can get in contact with. If you say, "Hey, I can't travel to the southeast or whatever, but I would like to, have this," contact me. If I can come to you and bring it to you, I would love to do that. Whatever helps build these relationships and these these ties that bind would be what we need. We need 1,000 different brush fires out there all over the place doing their thing, being self-sufficient and able to survive with little or no outside influence, because that, in my opinion, is the only way to really gain force multipliers in the situation that we're dealing with right now. So
Yeah.
Awesome. Well, Lance, thanks again for coming on the show, man. Guys, this was Lance from Selous Dynamics, helping us to train a better class of man. This has been another Meta Crash course. As always, stay in the fight. Hey guys, this is 6 and 7 with the Hard Time Strongman podcast. Wanted to take a second to do a mental health check-in and to tell you all about the 988 Crisis Lifeline. So, the 988 Lifeline is a national network of local crisis centers that provides free and confidential emotional support to people in suicidal crisis or emotional distress 24 hours a day, 7 days a week in the United States. You can reach the Lifeline at 988lifeline.org, or you can call or text 988 to get help, to get someone real on the phone.
Every struggle is different. Every struggle is hard, but you are not alone in whatever you're going through. As someone who has used the 988 crisis line, I fully recommend that if you're feeling any of those feelings of depression, suicide, hopelessness, get in touch with them immediately. They will help you. They will listen to you.
Once again, guys, you can reach the Lifeline at 988lifeline.org, or you can call or text them at 988. As always, guys, stay in the fight.
Stay in the fight.